Hello and welcome to another Red9 update. This one is a ProPack update for the Animation Re-Direct systems. This is something that I did a demo for a few months ago now, but the whole system has been radically updated. And I wanted to go through what it now does and what it's capable of. What I'm going to do is open up the redirector. Anyone who's used it before will notice that the UI has completely been ripped apart and rebuilt. And there's 3 or 4 different ways of redirecting, and I'm going to go right in at the deep end and go to the most complex version, because what I want to do is kind of show you what this thing's capable of, and then we'll backtrack and we'll go through what each one of these UI elements does. So what we've got is piece of animation data. Ignore that, that's just gash frame in there. We've got a piece of animation data, and basically it's of a guy walking around in circles. Now this was shot in a MoCap studio, and basically he's walking around in circles because that's the size of the volume that they had. Okay, but the idea is that actually he's not meant to be walking around in circles, he's meant to be going in a straight line. And obviously, how the hell do you do that? Well, to be honest, I've got no idea unless we had something like the tool that we're just about to go through. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a section of this and I'm going to straighten it out. What I'm going to first of all do is I'm just going to set time ranges, and time range, like everything else in Red9, is either the extent of the time range that you see, or it's the selected time range. If I did that, that would be the time range of our data. So I'm going to set it from somewhere around there, and we'll even go around the circles to about there. Okay, so we'll set the time range. Now then, as I say, we'll go through all of these points, what this all does in a minute, but I'm going to go straight in and show you what this thing is capable of. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select a reference point, something on the rig that we're going to use as the pivot. What it'll do is it'll get cast down to the ground plane, and again, we'll go through all this casting in a bit. But I'm going to select a reference point. I've turned everything on. This is as complicated as this thing gets. What I'm going to do is I'm going to build the raw guides, and the guides are effectively, these are the knots that control how we redirect through. And this counter here, this controls how many of these knots we put on the system. I think in this case 10 is probably not enough, so I'm going to just delete those guides and I'm going to put in, let's say 20. Rebuild guides. And I'm building them raw, and what that basically means is it's built the guides, but it's not actually taken the animation cache. It's not actually cached any of this data, it's just a raw guide at the moment. And the reason for that is simple. What I want to do is I want to control where the pivot is of this redirect, and the pivot is basically this triangle here that you see, and this is controlled by a motion path. So effectively we've got a motion path running along this, and that controls the redirect. Now there's a function here called fractional knots. This is changing the parameterization of that curve, and this is one of the reasons that we do this in 2 stages. We build the raw guides, we make sure this pivot is doing what we want, and then we take the animation cache, which basically commits the data to the cache, if you see what I mean, before we apply it. And I'm going to use it fractional knots. Now, there is a fundamental difference between this. When fractional knots is on, the data is purely based on the length of the curve. It says it there. When it's off, the distance between the CVs has an effect on the speed of this thing's travel. So in other words, if you were to redirect and you move this CV right next to that one, if this is off, the fact that these two are close together will slow things down, because the distance between these is the motion path. Okay, is the travel distance, and if we leave it on, that's ignored, and it's literally just from the start to the end is 100%, and it's the length of the curve. It's nothing to do with the closeness of the knots. So we're going to do that, and that tends to get us slightly closer. You can see that by using that diamond is sitting pretty close to his feet. And bear in mind, like I say, this is the pivot point that we're going to be redirecting him about. If we wanted to modify that, I can select motion path. This is the data that we're talking about here, the fractional knot point, this thing here. If we take that off and we want to do it again, it changes the value slightly. But what we're going to do is we maybe want to just slip this thing across. So what I can do is select that, go there, move that, and we'll just modify that value, maybe something like that, just for that particular key, just so it's closer to his feet. So that's tracking pretty well. Okay, so that's tracking his feet, and that's the pivot point we're going to use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sync the cloud, and that is effectively taking this animation data and pushing it to a point cloud that's relative to this node, which is how the redirector runs. Ignore the cycle, that's just a motion path. It's fairly standard on motion paths, unfortunately. Okay, so now we have the data cached, and you'll see the minute we've done that, the apply button becomes active because we know the data is ready to be redirected. And this is where we can have some fun. By default, I've built everything. So I've built the redirect path, and I've built these cluster handles. The cluster handles are basically their controllers I can grab and I can use to redirect the path. Okay, but we've got two new functions on this. One is lock to start and the other one is lock to end. Now basically this controls how these controllers are grouped. So if I go lock to start, we get a warning. And the warning is because what we do is when we switch these buttons, we take a pose cache. We actually take a reference pose of the state of the curve as it currently is, so that we can blend it back to that if we need to. And by the fact that we're switching these modes, we're regrouping the system, we have to update this. So I'm going to do that. And you'll see it says lock to start. So what that basically means is if I select any of these, they are chained together. And if I select, for example, that one, I can start unwinding it, and I can do it all manually. Okay. If I were to do it that way, lock to end, again we get the prompt because we're regrouping. You'll see it's doing the opposite way. It's grouped it the other way, and flat is basically there is no grouping. These are all individual nodes. But I'm going to do lock to start. And rather than manually go in and try and straighten this thing like that, which I could do, I'm going to use this, straighten. And lo and behold, I can grab that curve and I can go straighten. Now the straighten is based on the very first CV, and it's based on the points of this CV. Okay, so that's me straightened out. Okay, and you can see the curve is all straightened. And at that point, all I need to do is go apply, and that will reapply the motion data. And lo and behold, in 2 or 3 buttons, we've taken that piece of MoCap data and we've straightened it into a long line. Now obviously we could take this curve and we can bend this curve and we can move this however we wanted. But as you see, without doing any real work, we've taken this data and we've pushed it on a nice straight line. So that's the power of this thing. There's a section around here where he does a spin, and you see it's pretty good. And that's basically the pivot point. This pivot point is absolute key. This is the point at which the data is being redirected along this curve. Okay, so that's it in a nutshell. That's as extreme as it gets. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reload this sequence. And we're going to go through this UI in a little bit more care. So what we'll do is we'll open it up, redirect. Okay, and we'll take a small part of this and we'll just go through each function. So there's 3 different ways of redirecting this data. And the default one is this, where we build a redirect path, we build the guides like we've just done, but we don't build the clusters. So again, we'll go through that in a second. Excuse me. This button here, or this checkbox, this controls whether we're going to redirect on a path or whether we are literally just going to move a piece of MoCap data around a pivot point. Okay, so I'm going to take all of that off. So all of this now is disabled, and you'll see the new button comes up, this build full guides. And the reason for that is that when we're doing it on a path, we split it so you have chance of syncing that pivot point along the curve. When we're not doing it on a path, there is no curve to modify, so we just build the whole thing in one go. So in actual fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to load a slightly different piece of MoCap on this one. We'll load that one, just to make it a bit easier. Okay, so this one, if you've seen any of these demos, I use this piece of data all the time, okay, just because I'm used to using it. Okay, so with everything off, with this thing off, we are left with these as options. And basically in this mode, what it's going to do is it's just going to redirect from a point. So if I were to select a controller, for example, I'm going to do it over, actually there's not too much data in this, let's do the whole thing. I'm going to do it over the whole thing, set the range, and I'm just going to go build the guides. The object I select, wherever it happens to be, is the pivot point. This is where the thing will be. And if I build the full guides, off it goes, and what you'll get is a single pivot point, 2 reference meshes, start and end mesh, and if we go to world, that becomes our redirect. So it's a simple redirect in this mode. With this thing off, it's a simple redirect only. And the options on this, if I delete that, you see are all controlled by this thing up here. So the first one is the root pivot option, and the root pivot option is basically the object that I select. Where do you want the pivot to be? for this redirect cloud. Okay, so we have translates and rotates, and we have them on projected. Now, this is very similar to, if you've used the animation UI, it's very similar to this stuff down here with the relative pose. Projected and absolute is exactly the same thing. With projected, what it'll do is it will take this point and it'll project it down to the ground plane. So my pivot point will be down here on the ground. Okay. Same with rotates. With these two projected, what it'll do is the rotate pivot will be effectively going in the direction of this, but flat down to the ground. So if I do that, we got that object selected, build. You see, pivot point is directly above the arm, but it's flattened down to the world ground. It's also facing the same direction as the wrist controller, but it's being flattened down to the ground. So it's kind of facing the direction of travel, and that's all it is. With these two off, this thing becomes absolute, which basically means that will be the pivot. This angle here, that will be the pivot that we get when we do the thing, and that will be, you know, if you want to redirect, it's redirecting about that pivot. That's what this controls. The other one over here, the path Y height, this is kind of crucial, and by default it's left at projected Y, which basically means it's going to take that and it's going to flatten it down to the ground. These two are different, by the way. This is the pivot point, this is the path, okay, and how the path is constructed. So I'm going to do it is I'm going to take that off. I'm going to go flat relative, and flat relative basically will leave the height of the point here, but it will be flat along that direction of travel. So if I do that, oops, excuse me, if I do that, you see it's taking it from the height of the wrist and it's flat along there. Okay, but there's no height variant, it's just completely flat. I'll delete that, I'm going to do the opposite, and I'm going to go height variant, and you'll see the difference. It will track the height of this as it's doing it. So you see it's tracking the height. And these ones are more important when we're building these guides, because when we're building guides, obviously the position of these knots is really crucial. So two options. This one controls where this thing is and the direction this thing is. This one controls the actual path itself. Okay. So I'm going to delete all of that, reset it back to where it was, and we'll just do a base redirect. Okay. So we'll take redirect off on this one. I'm going to select something. I'm going to have both projected, build base guides. There's my pivot point, and I can just redirect the animation, put him over there and apply. Now you might ask, why not always project this pivot point to the ground? Well, that's fine. The problem is that if this character is up in a second floor building and he's up here somewhere, so you don't want to project to the ground, you want to project to where he is, which is why these are here. Okay. So that's a base redirect. Path is off, and all we've done is we've literally just gone, there's my reference point, build a cloud, grab this thing and move him around. I want him to be there, apply the data. That's just a straight, simple redirect. Okay, there you go. And he's doing that. Incidentally, the UI remembers this data. This data is cached in the scene. So if you were to close the UI, close Mayor down, come back the next day, open it up, and open the UI, everything will be in the same state, and you'll still be able to carry on processing this stuff. But let's do the more complicated one. Let's start using these redirect curves, etc. So I'm going to turn the first one off. Oh, sorry, on. This build redirect path. Difference between this one and this one. This one builds controllers that you can grab hold of. This one just leaves you with a curve that you can control the CVs of. So that's the difference. This one is a CV adjustment. This one is you have controllers that you can go away and select, group select, etc. So I'm going to do the second mode. And I'm going to grab that as the root point for this character. And I'm going to redirect maybe that point there. Set the time range. Build raw. Again, you'll notice it splits it. When we're in any path mode, we build two. We build a raw and then we sync it, which gives you the opportunity to come in and look at that. Well, instantly you can see that's wrong because we want it down here. We want it up here, so we know what's going on. So I'm going to delete that. And I'm going to go relative. That's because he's now up in space. So I'm having to use this flat relative. So it's going to be where he is relative to the height of this node. So let's do that again. There we go. Okay. And we'll just have a look at that. Now then, fractional, as we touched on earlier on, the fractional is basically does the do the CVs or does the distance between these knots actually have any bearing whatsoever on the data? Okay, so if we go to compound, so if I were to do this and collapse those 2 points in on each other, and then I come and have a look. Oops, let's just play that. Let's go back to the start. It has no effect. If I have it off, well, you can't really see it actually because it's quite quick. Did I grab the right one? Hang on a second, excuse me for a second. Yeah, let's grab these CVs again. Grab that one. Move that in. There we go. It's a bit more obvious there. So you can see the distance between these CVs is affecting the speed of that controller, which sometimes you might want, but a lot of the time you won't, which is where this fractional knot comes in, because that will just skip over and completely ignore that. It'll just carry on at the same speed because it's based on the distance rather than the distance between. Okay, so again, we can use that, and I can grab these CVs, and if I go into soft mode, for example, soft select mode, I can grab them and move them nice and softly. And that's one of the reasons for still having this mode in, because you can affect everything with soft selects, etc., where you can't on the clusters, when you build the cluster controllers. The other thing we've got is we've got this blend to original, which will blend it back to the original curve so you can see where it was and where it now is. And let's just apply that data. Did I sync the cloud? No, I didn't. Let's just go back. I'll just sync the cloud. There we do that, and then we'll apply. Whoops, wrong one, excuse me, I'm going mad in my old age. Let's apply that. There we go. So now he's taking that, and it's quite a sharp turn there because obviously we've closed all those CVs in and he's going around. So that's mode 2. So mode 1 is we do no path correction. Mode 2 is we do path correction, but it's based on the CVs. If I delete this, mode 3 is we do everything. We base the thing on the curve, but we have controllers that we're going to control this thing with. So let's do that on the last one. In fact, yeah, let's get that other piece of data back in. I'll open that one. Okay, so let's go back through the original stuff that we were going through. And we'll take a section, let's say that bit there, set the data, set this back to where it was. A few things that are also available. So if we select that, I'm going to build the raw guides. Again, this thing splits it, so you build the raw guides, you check that the pivot's correct, and then you sync the cloud. With that one off, we don't do that, we just build the guides because there is no way of adjusting that pivot point, so you might as well take the entire piece of data. So we'll do that. I'm going to build the raw guides. Again, CV count, that is the number of knots that go on this curve. The more you get, the tighter the data will represent that character. So for example, if he's coming around the corner, what you might find is that, let's find around there, what you might find is that it's maybe not quite hugging the data. You see the curve here, it's not quite doing what he's wanting to do. So if we up, for example, let's say 50, let's delete that, rebuild the guides, you'll see it tracks his path a lot closer. And because it's tracking his path a lot closer, it also means that the redirect, when you start spinning him around, will be more accurate because it's more aligned to his actual data. So we're going to do that. Again, fractional knots, this is this whole thing about distance between these has effect on the speed of that motion, or it doesn't. And again, if you hover over it, you get the hint as to what's going on. Everything's got hints on this, by the way, just to help through. Build clusters is what generated these controllers. And like I say, by default, they're built flat, which basically means it's a flat hierarchy. Nothing has an effect on anything else. And this is why this other mode is in with the CVs. Because if this was CV based, I could select that CV, do a soft select, pull the whole thing out, and it'd be nice and spline based. With this mode, it's a little bit more tricky because they are individual CVs. Again, so you kind of have to see what you're going to be doing and figure out which one you want to use between them. This one is, like I say, is the only one that's capable of stretching things out. And again, these things here. So select cluster controls, we'll select these base controls. The straightening out, by the way, is done by the fact that these things all aim off towards their child, or they're grouped as childs. So if I select them and I grab the rotates, that's because they're all flat. If I were to lock them at the start, which is this thing about the fact that they're all then locked, this thing's going to say you can't do this because you haven't taken the cloud. So we'll say cancel and we'll take the cloud. which again just caches the data. So let that do it. Okay, lock to start, which now means that these things are all pointed to each other. If I select them, go back into the rotates, I can maybe not quite like that, but I can control them and effectively straighten them out by doing the rotates. I can also, if I were to, it's probably the rotate Y, isn't it? So that's the rotate Y that's controlling them all. And if I messed up, I can go blend back to original, because this thing is all cached. So we cache the pose, which is why this thing's here in the first place. And if we wanted to, we just use the straightener, which will straighten things out. And again, when we're straight like that, for example, if we didn't want it quite so straight, we wanted to modify this, we can change the mode. We can go to flat, we can select a few of these things and we can move them about, do whatever we want. Obviously, with this amount of CVs, it's a little difficult to get nice big curves. But again, that's a hit that you take if you want it more accurate or less accurate. And we're just going to do the sync curves. Now the apply, you can apply as many times as you want. You can do it. If you don't like it, you can move the curves around, reapply, and it just keeps reapplying that data. Okay. So for example, you might say that's all cool, but what I really want to do is put a little kick in here. So if we're in flat mode, we just grab maybe those, move a few of these around. Oops. Move a few of them around. Let's say that one, like that, and reapply the data, and he'll now take this into account. So again, you can see the difference between building the curves and building them CVs. If I was adjusting this, it'd be much easier adjusting them on CVs, but I'm using this to straighten them out in the first place. Obviously, you'll now respect that little kick that's going in there. The other thing with this, because this is a Red9 rig, we can at any point put another mesh reference point in. And the mesh reference point is basically where it's a reference pointer to kind of allow you to align things up. I can just keep doing that wherever I want to go. You can see it's just taking more bits in. So it's a reference pointer. So if you're trying to line this data up with another piece of animation, this is the reference point. Okay, and they're all cached on this one node here. And then we'll just delete it. The actual system itself makes no binds to the rig at all. It's completely separated, so it doesn't, it's not bound to the rigging systems. The other thing is the way it does it is very much based on this setup here. So if this is correct, you'll see here we have the same filtering up here. This is the same filtering that this uses and the same filtering that the post systems use. So they're all tied together. By default with our stuff, we just put it on Red9 Dev Rig and it knows about everything. If you've got separate rigs that you're building, you might want to have a look through some of the filtering demos which are up here. This demo I'll bind up to the UI, so anyone using this can just reference it. And like I say, everything has help files bound to it. So we'll try and expand some of this thing as well. Okay, hope that helps. Give us a shout if you get into problems. Thanks very much. Bye.